Okay. Welcome everybody to this meeting of the Audit and Governance Committee taking place in the Walton Suite, Winchester, 6:30 p.m. My name is Councillor Neil Cutler, Chairperson of the committee. I have a few housekeeping points in. Please can I advise that the open parts of the meeting are being audio recorded, a video recording. Please can I remind all participants to speak clearly and remember to use your microphone. In addition, please speak directly into the microphone. This will ensure your comments are up for the audio video recording. I don't know if I'm actually doing that, so perhaps I ought to. Okay. Please can everyone ensure that mobile phones and other electronic devices are on silent or switched off entirely. In the unlikely event that it's necessary to evacuate the building, the fire alarm will sound. Please follow any instruction given to you by staff or fire marshals, or fire exits are marked by green exit signs. Proceed quickly and calmly to the assembly point, which is in Abbey Gardens. Do not use the lift. Welcome to everybody present. New members for the Audit Committee, and I've just realised that I'm still leaning away from the microphone every so often, so it's probably not working that well. So turning to the agenda, item number 1, apologies. I think we have apologies on Councillor Laming, and Councillor Baffo is deputising. And we have apologies from Councillor Godfrey and Cunningham, I think is.
That's correct, Chairman. Thank you very much.
Disclosure of interest. Does anyone have any interest to disclose?
It's going to.
So we'll move on to item number 3, the appointment of the Vice Chairperson for the 22-23 municipal year. Can I have nominations, please?
Thank you, Chair. I'd like to nominate Councillor Brock, please.
Do we have a seconder?
Yeah, I'd like to second, please.
Are there any other nominations? Councillor Bronk, then you are the Vice Chairperson for the year. I will endeavour to make sure that you don't have to take on the role of chair. Item 4 is Chairperson's announcements. I have none. Item 5, we move on to the business of the meeting. The minutes of the previous meeting held on the 8th of March 2022. Are you happy that we accept those minutes? I was in attendance, but not as a member of the committee, but I can't see any problems with the minutes. Has anybody else got any comments? Agreed. Agreed. Okay. Item 6 is public participation, which it doesn't appear that we need to go into. So we'll move on to item 7, the first substantive agenda item, which is the work programme for 22-23. Mrs. Kirkman, have you got any comments to make about the work programme?
Thank you, Chair. Nothing in particular to add, but perhaps to outline some amendments that we'll make to next year's timetable. When officers came to review this year's work, July was particularly full, and perhaps too full for a committee to take all those items in one meeting. We knew we had to call an extraordinary meeting of Audit and Governance to deal with the notice of motion, which is on the agenda this evening. So my thanks to Rob O'Reilly and Simon Howson, who were able to bring forward 2 papers that were originally timetabled for July to this June meeting. And I have moved my monitoring officer annual report from the original July meeting to the September meeting in order that we can get through the business at that July meeting. It's my proposal for the benefit of the new members. The governance workload, in my opinion, has been the area of increase in work for the committee over the past 2 years, and therefore the June meeting is a necessary meeting. We kept it in last year when we had some particularly big papers. We reverted back this year to the July being the first meeting, but actually, having looked at the programme, I do think it's prudent that we add a June meeting as well as July for the committee calendar next year. And June will certainly have a governance focus, and July will undoubtedly have a finance focus because of that, the end of year requirement. So, Chair, that's just a brief outline, but to say that I would recommend that to the committee for the calendar. Yeah.
Thank you. I mean, I think there is obviously the point at the moment that the 27th of September meeting looks fairly light. Simon even kindly offered to bring the Q1 report earlier to the July one, but the July one has rather a huge agenda already. So although it does seem light, I think the September one is necessary to go because we can't bring those 2 elements back into the July one. But I think it does give some opportunity that if there are any other issues that we need to raise for, that's probably the only meeting of the year where if there are areas that the audit committee would like to explore, I don't want to create too much additional work, but you know, if there are areas, we have got a bit of a space there. So, I mean, we will be having the risk management workshop on the 14th of July, which is not included in this timetable, but it is for Audit Committee and Cabinet. And I would really urge everybody, and perhaps we can encourage deputies as well to attend, because risk management is a key role of the Audit Committee, is looking at the risk management process, and it's not well understood. I think I understand it better than others, but it's something we've been trying to embed over the years. So it may be that we have some discussion on risk management in the September meeting once we've done the workshop. It may be useful. Has anybody got anything else they wish to raise on the work programme? Thank
you, Chair. I see item 25 with the Constitution review, date TBC, with Lisa's, Kirkman's name on it. Would that be moved into September, perhaps?
Not without a mental breakdown between now and then. Councillor Trask is that one. The constitutional review has been passed back to me last month, so I now have that back on my pile. And there's a lot of work has happened. We put some work out in order to expedite this, because appreciate, you know, this did pause for 2 years during the pandemic. But what I would also just, and I know I keep saying this was only a light touch review, because there was a 2-year review when we adopted the new constitution. So it was really just a check and balance to see how that was operating. But there are definitely some amendments. Some are just updates, some are legislation changes, some are role changes. So we do need those to be reflected. So I would love to say that I would bring this to you on the 27th. That's not going to be realistic, just because of time.
Do you think we might have your findings or a summary included in the annual report? Just keen that we don't lose experience and knowledge and insight.
I will ensure that that does not happen. It might not be in the monitoring officer report, but you know, if you need me to do some constitutional introductions, that would not be. But there's not a loss of that corporate intelligence around the institution. Absolutely.
need to change the timeout settings on my iPad because it's all disappeared. Okay, so we moving on to the next item. We have. Are you happy that we note the work programme? We'll move on to item 8, which is the workforce report, and I'd ask Bob O'Reilly to introduce it, please. Oh, sorry, Councillor Power, did you want to say something?
Just if I may, Chairman, this committee has shown an interest in the age profile of our workforce, which is in Table 6 on page 25. I'd like view of this committee as to whether it should be added to the risk management table on page 19. Be so kind.
Thank you. Rob, introduce.
Thank you, Chair. This is a snapshot report for information about the workforce, and it's obviously interested to get more information about workforce from various angles. It looks at the staff establishment, recruitment and turnover, sickness absence and equality. Also, it outlines some work that HR has been doing around the work we did following the last time committee. We set up the task and finish group, you may recall. Some of you were on that. And met 3 times, and the questions are mentioned at the end of the report. So the staff establishment first, you can see that we the 31st of March we had 431 employees. It's like a decrease in headcount. Not much really to say about the staff establishment, except it's fairly stable. But what I'll probably do, Chair, if that's okay with me. Do you want me to take questions as I go along, or all at the end? What would you prefer?
I'm happy if anyone does want to interject at any stage,
okay,
but otherwise,
putting their hands up.
But otherwise, we'll have a full question session at the end as well.
Okay, that's fine. So recruitment and turnover. So we had 60 external appointments last year, 44 permanent employees, and leavers, as we say, turnover has dropped to 14.5%. The average in the UK is 15%. The turnover is stable, but I think that certainly for meetings that I've been going to, my colleagues have been going to at regional level, I think a lot of councils are getting worried about recruitment going forward, and how fair in the certain times we find ourselves. One of the comments that's been made is one of the big selling points for local authorities in the past has been our flexibility, but post-pandemic, private sector firms also have previously had as one of our star benefits, if you like. So clearly don't often compete private sector in terms of salaries. So there could be some issues, but at the moment we haven't got a problem with tension, which is when you know you've got a problem losing staff and can't fill those posts. Still, there are a few pinch points, but there's not massive at the moment. Turnover goes above 20%. I think we will have a especially well over 20%. We'll have to keep an eye on that one, I think. The average length of service here is 10 years. Again, that's quite typical. Local government have relatively long length of service for people who stay here. Sickness absence. One of the things to note since the last time we met was that we have a revised absence policy, and we'll be doing some training on that for managers in September. But it's now up and running. And that gives us more clarity around things like return to work interviews, the role of occupational health, and how people get referred to occupational health, and some clarity around the process. Our managers felt to a certain extent they were being given too much discretion before about when employees should move to the next stage of the process. We've clarified that. And you can see the sickness levels have gone up slightly from 5.95 to 6.76 days per annum. Still below the 8.2 days quota by expert HR for public sector. We've got in there some information regarding the proportion of long-term, short-term sicknesses. Long-term has gone up, short-term's gone down. One of the well-known side effects of working from home is that people tend to struggle on a bit when they've got short-term illnesses, and will work shorter days or whatever, using flexi time, but will still attend for work. if they're feeling a bit under the weather and they've got to commute a long way and do a day, they probably feel they're not actually up to that. So you tend to find short-term absence times when work is allowed. But clearly long-term absence increased proportionately, as you'd expect. Mental health is still the predominantly number one reason. And 11.7, we give a little rundown of all the things we do as authority regarding mental health, which I've said before that other authorities I've worked at, I think, is excellent part of the city council culture. Our focus on issues through a variety of methods, not least our mental health first aiders. So we still have a health provider. So that's probably all I've got to say on sickness. But
Hi there. So it's a general point about you give some good statistics about the workforce, and in places you have pointed out some comparables and how they benchmark sort of in general terms. It seemed to me that there was great scope to be able to develop a more expansive sort of dashboard, HR dashboard, that showed benchmarks in all those areas against, you know, other councils, against other financial, say, sector, and I know we used to do that in one of my previous lives. We gave comparables, because not just of means but of medians as well, statistics, because it helps you isolate those outliers and where you are, you know, where you've got problems brewing. And I wondered whether that's something that, you know, you've thought about and maybe could expand on in the sort of HR dashboard.
I think that's a very fair comment, and I do try to put in some benchmarks where we can to give some context, so you know whether it's, you know, is that a big number is the first question you should ask when you statistics. The companies that used to provide that kind of information a bit out of business over the pandemic, so they're sort of coming back in line again. Whether we can afford to use them or not, we need to kind of talk to Lisa about that. So see whether, but we have in previous stories I have used those. In a lot of councils, I think these days, providing that information for other things. Certainly, there are kind of there are companies around that can give information, and we can perhaps happy to sort of next time.
Chair, I've got a question. Regarding the mental health issues we have, you mentioned here we have a mental health first aider. What's the actual take-up of that?
Well, we have 5 or 6 mental health. All the walls and corridors in your. So my experience of talking to them is parts, but clearly they're all confidential conversations and use statistics. I think that we and that clearly you could phone the counselling service just to somebody that you think. So certainly that's I think virtually every employee councils have. Okay, we'll move on to.
Sorry, Lisa just wanted to add something there.
Yeah, sorry, I just, it's the statistic that is one, there's a few offices that have really driven mental health and are most proud of, but I think it's 97 or 90%, 98% of the organisation know where to go to get mental health, at either the first aiders or through somewhere else. And that's really important that, you know, were they to come face to face with one of the, that was a really good staff survey result that we had. That was the, well, in both the last staff survey we did during the.
Okay, so the next part gives you some quality data. So in common with most local authorities, we have more female employees than male employees, 62%, quite closely aligned. Sector mentioned there the pay cap figure, same as the national one, we're 54. So we've going to give you some stats under the appendices about the from this information. The one that mentioned earlier, age profile, is important in the sense that we have over 100 employees who are over 55, and you know, clearly they may be thinking about to continue working for years. One of the consequences of the pandemic, incidentally, has been that a lot of people have taken early retirement, both in the sector. I think seems to have been a consequence of furloughing people. Or furloughed, sort of got off the kind of rat race, if you like, and not want to get back on again. They've looked at their finances, downsized slightly, taken a pension early, and that's one of the reasons we're short of staff across the country. So that doesn't seem necessarily to be happening here yet, but it's something to be aware of when you look at our age profile, I think. The rest of the profile, clearly ethnicity profiles will be, I think everybody will be more interested in this information when the census data comes out, because we're obviously so when you do census data, see how we compare to the local area when we get that. So there's nothing else on that. I'll go on to the HR update. Yeah,
there's one question here.
Hi, I will shut up in a moment, but
okay.
on the gender pay gap, what are we doing about it?
And the pay gap for an organisation of can change very, very quickly. This is a snapshot on 31st of March. If we would sort of probably one or two more highly paid staff, that would. So I think that if you look at our profile, clearly we have female staff than male staff. Female staff tend to be part-time. For the gender pay gap across part-time staff tend to be lower graded posts. I think we're keeping an eye on it, I would say. I don't think that we're virtually the same as the national level. I think when we recruit, the only way you can really do something about the pay gap, where we want to attract more female or encourage more female position. We haven't done that so far.
So do you think actually when you compare apples with apples, it's not as bad as that?
No, I think gender pay gap is to be expected in normally female workforce. They're likely to be far more likely to be part-time.
Thank you.
Sorry, we have one more question. Councillor Krask.
Thanks, Rob. So a question I think we need to Councillor. The age of the workforce. It's pleasing to see that reasons for leaving the council are going to public sector appointments. That's nice. Historically, they've not left for private sector, they've public sector. Mitigate that risk is, what are we doing perhaps around succession planning? So they've got a career council. They clearly want to work public sector, so let's keep them. Is there succession planning? It's related to that. We've had to hire replacements. What's the pay? Has there been an increase in pay required?
Okay. Well, succession planning in sector is a bit more difficult than the private sector because all of our jobs are open for internal applicants. Equal opportunity to apply for it. You can't have said to somebody in the van, when this person retires job, you see what I mean? And to kind of anoint a successor to Murdoch's empire or whatever, and that would do that in the sector. So I think you can say to people, you know, allow people to deputise, act up, or whatever, so they're in a position to put in a really strong bid for a job or something. You do that, and managers will always be looking in terms of kind of opposite of succession planning. It's continuity planning, really. What if the person left? Not necessarily because they just left to get another job, but what if they got run over by a bus, kind of thing? You know, what would we do? You know, who else is skilled, or at least skilled enough to get us into a position where we can the ship afloat? So that's something that's always going on. Service plans, appraisals, and so on, making sure that we do that. So that's the succession planning part of it. The part about do we pay more money? Clearly, if we're in a position where we're advertising a job and nobody's applying for it, then we look at what other people are paying, then we may be permission pay a market supplement to back somebody to the job, market rate. That again can be tricky. Other people similar job that they get a market supplement, why and I, and you can be very careful about how that stabilised teams. So market supplements tend to work better for solo type jobs, usually relatively highly paid jobs where you can't get anybody. You look at what other people are paying. It's grade, an extra 2,000. So it's something that has to be kept under review. You'll see just in the next kind of sentence down that we had our first test and finish group in January. We wanted to do some what we called action research. So we contacted 15 other local authorities about recruiting. We also spoke to about 20 plus people who had joined the organisation in the last year to say what was your experience, what was a barrier, and so on. And what we found was actually, it is, I hate the expression war for talent, but it is a kind of, we have to be quite competitive at the moment to make sure we're not deterring people from applying. And one of the things we felt was a deterrent was that we were just saying at that time, you can only apply through our application form on the website. Now that's fine for people who are tech savvy and so on. Other people think. More importantly, a lot of professions, they spend quite a lot of time and money on their CVs, and the idea of typing all that again into a form for Winchester City Council is quite tedious. And if you're fighting for talent, you want to get a lawyer who's spent a lot of time putting their CV together, you don't necessarily want to put that barrier in their way. So we've decided to our CVs and covering letters as an alternative, and we've used that very successfully for the service lead for comms, which I think last time the post was advertised, but nobody applied. This time we had a strong field and we made the appointment, and that's a good example. Again, you expect a comms person to have their CV polished up, certain professions like that. Similarly, we looked at the web page for Winchester City Council authorities, and look at New Forest District Council. Type that into Google, you'll see the page will come up, one of 4 jobs on it. If you do it for Winchester City Council, you won't find that. Lots of other very useful tiles on there, but not jobs. Jobs is down below our data privacy page. One of the things we're going to do, the ELB's approval, when we get together and make sure that jobs is really very prominent on. So I said we want to get a bit on the front foot when it comes to recruitment, I think, and make sure we get any very bureaucratic barriers out there and get.
Sorry.
Excuse me if I've forgotten it, but lead times for recruitment, I don't remember you referring to them. Can you give us an indication of sort of how long some of these posts do take to fill. And also, in the past, I don't know what ability you have to set resignation sort of periods, or whether it's part of a standard, public sector contract condition. But if obviously it takes a lot longer to fill than a person can resign and leave in, is there any ability to amend contracts so that people have to serve longer than a month, or a 3 month, or in some cases a 6 month time period, so that we don't have gaps, and we can have an adequate handover?
Yeah, I mean, there's it's possible, but it's quite rare to have handover described. The local does say someone's given their notice, start the recruitment process. There's a conversation between HR and the manager, description and the ad, so on. Advertised with the closing date probably 2 weeks later. Shortlisting, then the checks to make sure the person's in the country, and then we make the offer, and then they accept the offer, and then they give notice to their employer. So by the time we've done all that, if someone's given a month's notice, that person's probably left, and the other person's probably given notice to their current authorities. You might have a 6 week to 2 month gap when saying earlier about continuity planning, when the manager hopefully something allow that gap to be actually covered. I was interested in your idea about saying, well, could we make our notice periods longer? Clearly, that would have the benefit of resolving the issue that you've described. But I think it would have the disbenefit of making us uncompetitive with other employers. People who want to leave don't really like and that's the reason that we senior people do give 3 months notice, so we can have as kind of period before we hit without them as we can. Generally speaking, higher graded posts give 3 months notice, medium posts give 2 months notice, and give 1 month notice, and that's the same in all local authorities. So if we were to go away from that, and people looked at their contract and we offered them the job, they'd say, well, I'm on scale 4, there's no way I'm giving 3 months notice. I want to get my new job, might be more money, might be closer to home, whatever, So you need to bear in mind that that's a two double-edged sword, 2 sides of a coin, whatever, in that debate. So I don't think that would be something that I would suggest. However, I think that one thing that I'm interested in is making sure that managers are quite brisk about getting on with the recruitment. They don't kind of say, well, when do you want to do the interviews? Well, I'm going to hold there, and you need to kind of say, okay, this is urgent, let's get on with it. And that's something that HR is always trying to say to managers. You need quite a tight timetable to get people to get someone in quickly.
Councillor Miller.
I agree with Rob. Try and tie people in with long notice periods. It ends up with very dissatisfied staff, very low morale, people being fed up they don't want to be here anymore, and the other people knowing that they are now not necessarily working as hard as they should. And I think the answer is more, how do we recruit people quicker and get on with it, rather than actually tying people in that don't want to be here? Because once they've made their mind up to go, very few people work as hard as they used to.
I tend to agree with you, and of course the knock-on would be that if we extended our notice periods and everybody else extended the notice period, you've still got the same problem. Because as soon as you recruit someone, they've got a long notice period. It's the speed of recruitment is the key there to minimise the gaps. Councillor Atchwell.
Councillor Atchwell, can you use your microphone?
Yeah, sorry. I don't know if it's normally reported. I'm just looking through the report here, but how many current vacancies are there? Do you have an idea?
I haven't got that figure with me at the moment.
I'd like to know also how that compares, maybe.
Yeah, I mean, turnover's down, so I don't think it'll be time last year, but turnover does tend to vacancies ebb and flow just naturally. They're less likely to hand in notice or look for jobs at Christmas, for example. So you take a slow period for people leaving and starting, and then New Year's resolutions, you get lots of people applying for jobs and things like that. So it tends
Lisa, did you?
Chair, if this is just helpful, I think it's very much a risk-based approach in terms of some of our roles that are leaving us. And I give the example of the service lead for legal. That was a post where there was a significant risk to the organisation if that was a vacant post. I have two very busy managers in that team. They could not take on that caseload on a temporary basis. So that's where we moved to get an immediate interim service lead for legal in, so that the post holder that was leaving could hand over her caseload to the interim. And that's Neil MacArthur, who's with us now, and he won't leave until he's handed over to the permanent replacement. And that's where the risk was too high to not have that continuity. And therefore, that's why we have interim in place. So there are times when we say we simply cannot have that gap in the organisation.
Want me to continue? Okay, so looking at 11.22, so we talked about recruitment, which is the first bullet point. We had some quite detailed conversations about apprenticeships at the task and finish groups, and taken a report to ELB suggesting a supernumerary, what we might call corporate apprentice. ELB have asked me to do some more work on that because there's some thoughts about how should we link apprentices to the National Graduate Scheme, make sure that they're not kind of basically from a corporate perspective. Also some thoughts around it may be that we'd be better to get apprenticeships on a longer term basis, re-apprenticeships in something like planning, because it'd be a good way of growing our own. The slight disadvantage with the National Apprenticeship Scheme, which is framed by government legislation around the levy and so on, is that unlike the old days when you could just pay for training yourself and give somebody what's called a learning agreement to sign, so we spend all this money on you, but you've got to stay with us for 2 years, otherwise you back. You can't do about apprenticeships. It's not. You could train these people, and they could say that they finish that training, they can go and work for the private sector. There's nothing. But nonetheless, I think it's probably so. We're gonna do a bit more work on that and bring it back to ELB around issue. The other one that we should actually look at appraisals and review the form that we use, which we will for next year. So we'll review it. Although I didn't think anyone thought there was anything wrong with it. It was just saying whether improvements. So we will look at that in due course. The other thing that you might have noticed is going on at the moment, if you've looked at the television screens and there's go up and down the stairs, is we have an employee attitude survey going on at the moment, or staff surveys. And the closing date for that is due to be this Friday, but we're going to extend it for another week, which typically you do with staff surveys. You give them a deadline, they give another week, so just catch up the last few people and give them another excuse to send an email out reminding them about it, which we'll do tomorrow. One of the things that we'd like to do is to invite members just to discuss the results and decide, what, if anything, we should do with it. We've also tend to do that with Unison as well, and with the staff forum, ELB, so that we can decide what action we should take, if any. I don't think it's before you see the results that we need to take action, because you might not need to, but at least we should have this chance to discuss that. And I wouldn't want HR to be making those decisions on their own. I think we need to have as wide a discussion as possible. So I'll circulate this in a bit more detail, but we've set aside a couple of dates. I know people are going to be busy over the summer holidays, so the 6th and 7th of September, possible dates with 5 p.m. kickoff in the boardroom. So if anyone is interested in doing that, if they'd like perhaps would it be best to just email me direct or go through the chair to say, what I'm thinking of is that a selection of people from this committee could form just an informal discussion group. We can come up and we can add that what you desire into the thoughts of me in Unison. An organisational wide response to the survey every year, every June after that.
Yeah, I think a reminder and perhaps formal invite to members of the audit committee, okay. and then we go from there. I mean, it wouldn't be the end of the world if everyone turned up, presumably.
No, not at all. Not at all.
So, I mean, I think if it just goes out as a general invitation to members of this committee, it would be.
Okay, we'll do that. So the next one, 1124, mentioned about some of the training we're doing around suicide. We've published a set of menopause policy and a revised absence management policy. We're going through all of our policies one by one to see whether they need revising and updating. And the next two in the pipeline of the grievance, currently called the Resolving Workplace Issues policy, but actually should be called the grievance policy. It's quite soon. And then after that, we'll review the disciplinary policy, keep that streamlined as well. And we've got other. So we'll do the whole suite in the end. But at the moment, I said we're focusing a lot on recruitment, as I thought mentioned earlier. There's a lot on in HR at the moment. Certainly those who are at this House and Finish group will know. So that's that concludes my report.
Thank you, Rob. One suggestion that Lisa's just made is that you have that look at the employee attitude survey. It might actually be something that's useful to report back to the 27th of September meeting, so that we have some understanding of what the outcome is as well, if that's possible. I mean, it needn't be a lengthy report, but members will have attended the initial meetings, but just some understanding about what the conclusions or what comes out of that report might be useful at that meeting. I'm not asking for a long paper or but a little report on that might be useful, and some discussion here, because it is one of the roles of this committee.
Yeah, I'm quite happy to do that. People PowerPoint presentation out in colour or whatever, see the results in your paper or before you come. Discussion around it.
That would be very helpful. Do we have any questions before we move? Any further questions before we move into on Councillor Atwell?
Yes, sorry. Do we have an idea of how many agency staff we? Is that in the report? I can't see.
Got information to hand. The number of agency staff. But they're not employed directly through HR, because services will, that's a recruitment agency, and it's more of a finance thing almost than HR, in the same organization. We've got skills that they need, comes to legal and so on. So it's not a question that HR will find easy to find out the number, and if I find out the number today, it'll be different tomorrow. But we can certainly have a look at that. I can say that the council spends a lot of money on agency. Someone's looking at the accounts, is about working out what our spend on agency is. But I'm happy to speak to my finances and information on that.
Okay, with you, Chair.
Yeah, that would be very helpful. I mean, there was one other figure that you were after as well. So
which I can't remember what it is now. Sorry.
Vacancies.
Yeah,
but number, I've got that.
Number of vacancies. So if we can have just those. Are there any other questions that anyone has? I mean, I have one which relates to Councillor Krask's comments about succession planning. It's more, not so much succession, as is there advice available on career progression? Because, as you said, people tend to move areas, but is it easy for staff who are ambitious to have a discussion about where they might go?
Look, the appraisal form does have a section on it about dance, so there is a different people that like. When I started off in local government, it was encouraged that you would go to another authority before you came, and you'd come back here, if you see what I mean. We were one big family then, so the idea that you'd stay with one authority, especially one size of Winchester, encouraged to go and work maybe for Hampshire and somewhere else. So it was interesting he was saying about, someone was saying it's nice that people go into public sector appointments, very much to kind of rule sort of. Now we're seeing that we obviously were a bit more kind of active of our own staff. But to be honest, it is quite difficult to say to someone in an organisation of this size, you hang on, and you'll get promoted, unless someone's actually said, I'm going to retire in 5 years' time, and sticks to it. I think career planning is more about owning your own career. So if you get these skills, HR plan, you will be able to move on in your career. It may be here, depending. If it's not here, it may be somewhere else, and you may want to come back here. Some of the best people I've ever had work for me are people who worked for me at one stage in their career, went off somewhere and came back. The two different cultures makes them a much more rounded way.
Thank you for that. Are there any more questions? I'd suggest we move into a debate on this, and particularly Councillor Power raised the issue of risk, the age profile. I think that there's also something slightly broader in this, in that you discussed about the fact that although the indicators are that the labour market may be very difficult as time goes forward and our turnover is still fairly low, there is the potential risk there more broadly about it shifting. You said there were no signs of it shifting, but you've had the discussions with other authorities where there is a concern about this, and I think how we deal with that in terms of the risk to the organisation is something that we need to consider in this committee. So if I kick off with that idea, do I have any other comments? Stephen.
I think just really to emphasise what you just said, that talking to people in the private sector, finding staff is becoming more and more difficult, and I think we're going to come under a lot of pressure for our staff to be recruited outside if we're not careful. I think we need to be taking real measures to make sure that we take care of our staff and perhaps encourage them to know there is a way forward. Rather than just reporting to your own line manager, I want to progress. Well, he doesn't like you or doesn't want to move on. You know, should we have a wider scope for going elsewhere inside the organisation? I think our staff, getting the right number of staff is going to be incredibly difficult for us in the next few years. The real shortage of people out there generally.
Councillor Power.
Thank you, Chairman. Yes, the labour market is on our worry list, along with inflationary pressures in general. Finance staff are currently trying to map that because factual exposure, staff retention, and I wouldn't be surprised if the mileage rate went up. Been at 45p for about 20 years, I think. Staff are working on that to try to get a handle on our risk, both this year and next year. So it is working. Thank you.
Mike.
Yeah, I certainly wouldn't want to go against Councillor Power's assessment of risk. Certainly, as you say, Chair, something that should be on our risk register. So I can only support that. Cost of living, war for talent, and the fact we are a small council. I mean, there's various mitigations we could do. We are looking at that. But if it comes to looking to compete with the private sector, going to be challenges for sure. I think the whole package is something to promote in the public sector in terms of pensions. It's going to be an increasingly preferred benefit versus what you get. Are there other mitigations we might consider in terms of, dare I say, sharing of services? Perhaps is there something that considered in the spending review?
Well, I think that once that risk is into the recognised, that then the strategic service review would have to take into account some of those aspects. Goes forward. I just wonder if this is a point also to talk about move towards agile working. As we come out of the pandemic. We haven't actually had a report on that, but that could be quite a crucial element. I mean, Bob made the point that that used to be a benefit, that we were more flexible, and now the private sector, the tendency to be more flexible. So actually getting it right with the way that we develop agile work is quite important. And I know leading on that. Got anything to add to that?
Only Councillor Cutt that you also asked me to go on the scrutiny agenda at scrutiny's last meeting, so I have no issue taking it somewhere, but I prefer to take it to one place. Audit and governance is about controls and frameworks. You can argue it either way, but I think if we take it to one place, I think that would be.
No, I wasn't asking for a full reporter on it here. I was just saying that is an element in what Councillor Krask was talking about, what our offer is, how effectively we deliver agile working, both from the point of view of efficiency within the organisation, but also it being an employee benefit that we are flexible. I think our two sides of. So I'm not asking that it comes here, but that it's included in the process. I'm not asking for more reports.
No. That's really helpful, Councillor Cutler. Thank you. I think the workforce report could probably let you know what our entire package is, because absolutely local government pension scheme is right up there. Councillor Krask, Winchester as a place is a real draw for people working in Hampshire, because you do tend to go from one authority to the other within a geographic range. You know, does agile working mean that's opened up further? Quite possibly, but we do have our healthcare cash plan scheme. We know that we changed our leave allowances. I believe that was 2019, so that we were far more competitive, and certainly the best, or if not the top few in Hampshire in terms of our leave allowances that are offered. So perhaps we can just outline what those are, including what our flexible offer is, because we had. Oh, let me remember this stat. I think 46% of staff were working flexibly prior to the pandemic, and obviously that amount has increased significantly in terms of the availability of them now being able to work from home.
Can I make a suggestion then at the September meeting that we follow up on the staff survey, but also could have the details of that package? Then that would be a sort of agenda item that, and also would fulfil us getting the information that we wish to have.
Just one point of information, Chair. I don't know if it's changed, but my understanding is that we're not allowed to actively promote the local government pension scheme unless you're an actual pension advisor. Thing for you to join. It obviously is a good thing for people to join. Yeah, we can say do it. Can't we make that? Sell it. Mention it.
Okay, Councillor Bolton.
Sorry, a bit of feedback. The age profile thing is a huge problem. I absolutely agree. And one assumes that they're at the top of the scale on the whole, and they're some of your most experienced staff. And with the employee engagement survey, are you going to be able, I don't know what the questions are, so first of all, I'd love to see what they're being asked, you know. But also, are you going to be able to profile that so that you know what the results are for that age group? Because there's going to need to be an enormous amount of work done to attract people at the highest scale end that have got that experience, because that's where you're going to be losing it. And just sort of trying to recruit, you know, a lot of 20-year-olds out of university and that sort of thing, is still going to leave you with an experience hole, isn't it, in the next few years? I just wondered if you could comment on some of those points.
Rob, could you put your microphone on?
The survey questions are online, so if you want to see. But obviously you'll see them when we do the results next time. But it's the kind of thing you would expect in a survey. That thing like the statements that you say strongly agree to strongly. So I'm proud to work for the council. I see myself still working there in 12 months' time. I think get positive feedback from my manager. we've kept the demographics quite simple to get people to assess them where they work. I think next time around, we can, when we discuss the results, we might say, well, add in other demographics. Like one of the disadvantages of that is that when you do an employee attitude survey, quite often get an external do it because they're more demographic questions. At the moment, we're doing in-house, cheap, quick for us to do it without. I prefer to keep on doing that, and age will be helpful. So I can tell you from employee attitude surveys I've done that people have been here for less than 5 years are way more enthusiastic about the council in the last 5 years. Which is, well, the council I worked for before might be really different here, but it does seem to be something that new people think it's fantastic here, but people who've been here for 20 years have kind of forgotten all the great things about it.
Thanks. Just reflecting on, Rob, the comments you made around used to be practice that you move around.
We should call it the local government boundary.
It's just wondering, just an observation around what I thought was concern with people leaving, the opportunity to say might not be able to get progression within Winchester. Join us and you get experience council in a relatively small council across the spectrum of skills, or you go deep, and this is where people have moved on to. I don't know if we can do if there's any exit information around why people have left, where they've gone to. Some stories to say, look, we've had people join us and this is the career progression they've had beyond their time with us.
Excellent idea. We do get that information through our questionnaires, but we're on the survey. Actually, I thought you were going to go somewhere different with that idea. I thought you were going to say that actually try and team up with 2 or 3 other district councils to say, when we advertise our jobs in turn, versa, so people can say, actually, I can move here, but I can also move to neighbouring councils, which probably circulation between almost like a smaller version of the local government. Something that exploring if you get other people to play ball, of course. But either someone might say, well, I do a few years here, then maybe do a few years and a few years around that circle, be building up experience as I move up the career ladder. Might need to get promoted. We'll have to think about that as well.
I think there's a real danger of us actually advertising other councils' jobs, because one of our problems is living in Winchester itself and in the district is very expensive. You know, if we start advertising what East you've got and our staff will live in Chandler's Ford or Hedge End, you know, we could aggravate our problems. So I'd be very careful of that.
It's a pros and cons thing, isn't it?
Right. I think we've given, had a good discussion around this. Recommendation is the report be noted. I think we should add to that we note the report, but recognise the potential risks given the current employment situation and the age profile of the council, and recommend that that those risks are investigated and added to the risk register.
Yep, that's absolutely, Chair. And just to say, in the Q1 report, I'm looking at Simon, the risk register comes back to audit and governance in any event. One, isn't it? Because March. Yep. So that will be coming to your September meeting, and that's a fuller conversation about risk register, because there is already a staff capacity risk, but it's how we articulate that. So we can look at those words, and then that will be before audit and governance.
That actually ties in with the fact that I said that we have the risk workshop on and suggested bringing something back. Actually, it's already on that agenda, so that's good. Okay, Well, thanks for that. Thanks, Rob,
Okay, thank you.
for your time and the detail there, and I think a very useful discussion.
Yeah.
We'll move on to the next item, which is the Q4 governance monitoring report. Simon, introduce it.
Thank you, Chair. This report is the Q4 Governance Monitoring Report. It's the last report of the financial year 21-22. It provides the usual quarterly updates for declarations of gifts and hospitality, the annual governance statement, and internal audit reports. We've given a full update on overdue internal audit actions with a short narrative as to the progress of those actions, as well as numbers and a profile of the age of those overdue internal audit actions. For this report, we've also expanded with a narrative on the progress of 3 particular internal audits, that being health and safety, disabled facility grants, and records retention and disposal. We felt that those particular audits needed a bit more reporting on, given the prominence. I think from memory, each of those internal audits were limited assurance opinions. So we felt it would be helpful for members to understand a little bit more of the background of those, in particular in the internal audits, the issues that the auditor raised, and the work that managers are doing to mitigate and treat those weaknesses and observations that were made by the auditor in the audit reports. We've got a very short update on risk management. Members will remember last time the risk management policy was brought before you for comments before being adopted at Cabinet, and has already been mentioned in the Q1 report. We'll bring a full update on the corporate risk register as discussed. And then finally, we've got an update on the code of conduct complaints. Happy to go through page by page or take any questions.
Yes, I think it might be quite useful, if you don't mind, to have several new members of the committee to just explain what our internal audit arrangements are with the Southern. Quite unique in some ways, so just for the understanding of the new.
Thank you, Chair. The Council makes use of the services of the Southern Internal Audit Partnership, which are based up at the Hampshire County Council, and they provide our internal audit services on a partnership basis, contractual basis, if you like. At the beginning of every year, and from memory, I think it was March, an internal audit plan is agreed with the monitoring officer and the Section 151 officer for the year, and that audit plan is based on risks. So the auditors will review our corporate risk register, look for where there are issues and areas of concern, and then base their audit plan on that. There is a fixed number of days that they will spend auditing our services throughout the year, and they will apply those numbers of days to the actual internal audits that they will provide for us. They will agree the scope for each audit with the relevant officer responsible for that internal audit before they commence the audit, so it'll be properly planned and scoped, agreed, before they actually come in and do their field work, do their investigation on behalf of the council to look for where there may be some weaknesses in governance or other areas, and then they will compile a draft report then provided back to the manager for accuracy and fact checking, or it's then returned back to the auditor. Fundamentally, any observations of weaknesses that are observed by the auditor, the manager is then required to complete the action plan, if you like, with management actions, with key dates and responsible officers, to show how they will treat, mitigate, manage those particular weaknesses observed. It's then this committee that manages the progress of those actions through those audits, and there's a section in this report that shows how many audits have been issued in a year, how many audit actions are overdue, and the progress of those internal audit actions. And it's not until those audit actions have been completed that they're properly signed off and then updated to this committee to show that that audit was completed and the audit actions have also been completed. Give that assurance to the committee that the actions have been completed and the weaknesses have been addressed.
Thanks for that, Simon. That's a very, very good summary of that process. But I'm also conscious that having 2 brand new councillors, there were 2 terms that you used there, Section 151 officer and monitoring officer, which we may need some definition. I think we understand it having been on the council for a long time, but just quickly what the role is. Perhaps Lisa's best place to say that as the monitoring officer. But...
You'd like to think so, Chair, wouldn't you? Indeed. So in local government, you will have 3 statutory officers. You have your head of paid service, which is most usually the chief executive and is here. You have a section 151 officer who is based around finance and is normally also known as the chief finance officer. And the monitoring officer is concerned with the legality of decision making in the main. Whilst they don't have to be legally qualified, if they aren't legally qualified, for example, they could be an auditor by background, they must have access to legal advice. And those make up your golden triangle, as it's sometimes called, of the statutory officers.
I'm conscious both James and Neil, do you have any further questions on that? It's useful that you had a definition of both those. Section 151 in particular has a statutory duty to make sure that we set has a duty to speak out sometimes. Councillors' decisions may not be. Okay, so let's get back to we'll get back to the paper itself, and as you said, we can either go through it page by page, or we can just move into each section. Do we have prepared questions from anybody, or shall we move through it? I think the best approach is that there's the main body of the report and then the appendices. Appendices show position on the internal audit reports to start with. So do I have any questions on any of those? And there is obviously we've noted, again, sort of for history purposes, there was a time when we had pages and pages of outstanding actions. It was the aim, I think, both of the previous chair and the previous chair, the chair before that, to get it down to being 1 or 2 sheets of paper, no more. Seem to have succeeded pretty much with that. There has been a little bit of slippage the last year in terms of the number of outstanding. Obviously, one of the real concerns has been their high priority. And so one of these reports, the capital program and monitoring, was a report that came in as one outstanding action, and that is the role of this committee to monitor it. If anybody has any questions of where we are, there are explanations in the paper. Need further explanation. Now is your chance to ask.
Actually, there was one comment, I can't find it now, but it mentioned that the reason why the action hasn't been completed is because you've had a member of staff leave or something like that. I can't remember where it is now in all of this. And it sort of comes back to Councillor Cass' question about the phrase you used. The people coming up through the organisation, where, as Rob mentioned, not so much that, anointing people with you're going to get that job, but actually having other people able to take on those responsibilities. And if you're having those sort of succession planning issues, I couldn't think of the darn phrase, but I don't think of succession planning as the sort of anointing. I think of it as having a broad base of employees that you can promote into these positions, because you might not be able to get them from outside. And it actually seemed to me that your you are having some of those issues.
Yeah, I think the very specific one you've got is actually the building control one, which it says in here that
That's it.
owing to reduced management staffing within the building control team. And of course, building control is one of those areas that you probably haven't got people in, you know, it's a very specialist area, and you probably haven't got people that you can put in there, so you need to approach it slightly differently. But your point's well made, but I think in this particular example, building control would be quite a difficult one, because it's very specialist. That I don't know if you'd agree, Simon, but.
No, I would agree, Chair, and indeed that team is a particularly small team as well.
The other example is the health and safety audit, which again, you know, took place 18 months ago, and has taken a long time to get the progress, simply because it was getting a new health and safety manager in place, and again during the pandemic, not necessarily particularly easy to be able to take the actions that they need to do anyway. Any other comments on those two? Looking at page 31 and 32, those two pages, which are the summaries, and then we move into 33, where there are and 34 that have the more specific detail on safety and disabled facilities grants there, and also the information government. Has anybody got anything they wish to raise? Are there any questions? Mike.
Thank you, Chair. I think previously in building governance there was a recognition of the massive amount of work and the pressure officers were under with COVID in terms of the mental health, the workload, the way they did the work, the transition to virtual flexible working, the additional work to manage all the communication. So I think there was an understanding by the committee around that, because of that, and actions associated with that. Are we through COVID, do you think? Are we back to normal? Yeah, that's probably the question. Thanks.
Chair, we've certainly seen an increase over the last few years in overdue internal audit actions, and that absolutely is in the main due to COVID, and particularly when you look at the partnership working internal audit, the lead for that was somebody that was heavily involved with works on grant funding, high streets, etc. So her time was very much spent COVID response rather than dealing with internal audit actions. I think as we've moved further forward and out of COVID, that hopefully we will start to see some of these numbers of internal audits reduce from the levels of where they are at the moment. I think what's pushing the numbers up a little bit is that what we're seeing is a number of internal audits that have been completed recently, where there's quite a high level of actions that the managers have put in required to mitigate and treat those weaknesses that have been observed. So the disabled facilities grants, one particularly, I think it's something like 14, 16 individual actions, and it only takes a few of those to become overdue that will then make the overall number overdue. But I think hopefully we will start to see the numbers come down to that more manageable level. And I do remember it wasn't not that long before COVID we were at single figures. I think it's going to take a little while to get there yet.
Thank you, Simon. Any other questions on that part of the report?
Page 29 shows, I think, that there were 6 issued reports, and we know that there were 6 issued in draft and yet to be made final. So that's half the internal number of reports. It might not reflect the number of man days allocated to those topics. Are you confident that that we're going to be able to sort of catch up in order to not have an ongoing sort of lag of internal audit work and then a flurry of reports that management then need to try to deal with in order to meet our calls for the completion of last year's work plan?
Chair. I actually received 2 final reports earlier today, so 2 of the 6 have been completed. The other 4 are being worked to. I forget the exact details, but I think 1 or 2 have been delayed, but I haven't got the details to hand at the moment. But coming to your next meeting will be the internal audit annual report and opinion. There's no appendix to this report that you normally see from the internal audit because it is the end of year report. The end of year report for the internal audit is their final report for the year, the annual report and opinion, and that will come next time. And that will give an update on those 6 remaining reports. As I say, 2 were issued earlier today, and so that will come forward then.
Right, I think we've covered the internal audit. We then have the table on the action plan update. I think is. Are there any questions there? And then we have the code of conduct complaints. Does anyone wish to raise anything on the officers' report on code of conduct complaints?
I've been sat on a few of the sort of interviews and things on this. I understand it's a difficult thing to deal with, but looking at it from the outside point of view, our time for dealing with them would be seen to be unreasonable to the public. They may not be unreasonable given the system, but a lot of them seem to be waiting for independent personal advice. Is there any way we can speed this sort of process up? Because people that make a complaint expect it to be dealt with in a matter of months, or certainly not well over a year, shall we say. I know we've had some in the past of our own councillors that have taken years to sort out. And I just wonder if there's any way we can speed that process up for our credibility with the public.
Councillor Miller, I absolutely take that completely on board. The 2 eldest complaints on your sheet dating from 2020, and I can't talk too much about the details of these because we haven't got to that stage, but on the first one, it took 6 months to get the information. We had to down tools while there was a separate complaint made about my team for age discrimination. This has been an incredibly difficult complaint with the complainant, and we've been unable to secure the complainant's attendance at a subcommittee hearing for several months. And you do get to a stage where you say we will convene a subcommittee regardless of that, but then you do have to consider those rules of natural justice and all of those things. So we've tried to be fair, but we absolutely will get to a position where we have to move forward on that. In respect of the 5th of October complaint, we did say that further extensive complaints were received over several months. We had to start refusing complaints in respect of this particular parish council because it exceeded 20. So the work that goes into interviewing all of those people or any of those people named within a complaint of that size has been vast. And the consideration of the handling of such a significant issue has absolutely taken time. And this was during the COVID pandemic. So pandemic work was absolutely prioritised. This one is particularly tricky. I am very pleased that progress has been made in the last 2 to 4 weeks. And that one might not be there on the 27th of September. So, but yes, these are the 2 where I've got a significant focus. Where it says to complete report or independent person's advice received, Matthew Watson and I are working on those reports. They will be issued before the next meeting. So that's another 3 off. Unfortunately, Councillor Miller, where I said under B, we'd had 7 contacts and they hadn't led to complaints. I had 3 in since these papers were published. And that's just the way, I'm afraid, these code of conduct matters happen. You know, you think you're okay and you've had a quiet period and you can shift, and then you get 3 all at once. So it's one of those situations. I will talk more in the monitoring officer report about where I think some of these frustrations are coming from, but they are very much frustrations leading to bad behaviours rather than, I don't think we have a systematic issue with bullying across the Winchester district, for example.
Thank you, Lisa. Mike.
Thank you. I think you just answered my question, but I'll ask it anyway for an elaboration. Can we imagine there's any, without going into details, are there any themes that we might identify that might lead to, for example, training on the code of conduct for councillors, perhaps?
I will cover this in the monitoring officer report, because that annual review is to kind of look back and check if there's any themes or reoccurring issues. I mean, I've been quite honest with this committee in others, but I'll repeat it for new members. Certainly my issues during the pandemic were relationships between chairs and clerks. So where some training will help is that some people believe that they can come to me as monitoring officer to make complaints about a clerk of a parish council, and that's not the case. They're an employee of the parish council, and my remit is only in respect of councillors, whether parish councillors or city. So that's a point absolutely that I will raise in there. I think a lot will happen during this year in terms of model code of conduct, because as Winchester City Council looks at its own code of conduct and the model from the local government organisation, how much of that will we adopt? Because when we adopt a new code, if we adopt a new code, we will let all of the parishes know that, because many parishes will simply adopt the code of the City Council. And Councillor Crest, that makes my life much easier, because when I get the complaints in, I'm looking at the same code, but that's not the case for every parish, and we do have to look at every parish's code against their code when we get complaints in.
Vivian.
Regarding the time of the complaints, I mean the length, is there a limit? Can you say maybe after 3 years, right, that complaint's not going to get resolved? We have to keep going till it is resolved.
Yeah, Councillor Latchwell, we'd be in the High Court if we did that, I'm afraid. So no, we can't set a time limit. What we do we have I think it's Appendix 2, it's the assessment criteria for complaints. So we say if they're more than 3 months old. I believe the pre-2019 constitution was 6 months, and that was reduced. So it just means that they're asking that if you make a complaint, that you make that complaint promptly. And there are other assessment criteria, such as if you're no longer a councillor, we can't process a complaint. So a complaint that was long-standing could fall away where someone was no longer a councillor, but could have been a year in the making and just falls away, because we absolutely have no jurisdiction over someone who's no longer a councillor. So that's an example where that can happen. We have tried to set expectations. We know that some complainants simply think it's a 10 working day turnaround, like our complaints process. So we're now very explicit in terms of saying it's usually up to 6 months. We would like to do them within then, and that's absolutely, that's always the starting intention. In terms of how we inform now, every time we get a complaint in, we acknowledge that complaint with the guidance for complainants, the form if they haven't used the pro forma form, because we want to be very, very clear with complainants that they understand that their name will be given to the councillor who they've complained of, unless they have sensitive reasons for us anonymising that they could be called to be a witness to the alleged breach at a subcommittee hearing, because that's not normal in a normal complaints process. So we want people to be aware of that. And then we also outline timescales. So we're giving the complainant the best information we can straight up to try and manage those expectations. But certainly, I think there can be some improvements made in terms of keeping complainants up to date with the progress that's being made.
Thank you.
Thank you for that outline of what goes to complainants. I've had parish councillors get in touch saying, am I able to give them any indication of how complaints are handled, because they've been approached with the details of a complaint against them, but given no indication of how they're being asked to respond, what will be done with the response, how long the process might take, and what the outcomes might be. So, can that bit of balance be added to the process?
Yeah, absolutely, Councillor Bronk. In terms of, we've always had a guide for complainants. It equally applies to a councillor who has been complained of, and certainly we've recently added to code of conduct training over the last few years to outline what happens when a complaint's made, because we did realise that's something that our own councillors weren't aware of if that happened. Yeah, so absolutely, I think we can extend that, of course.
Thank you. Are there any other questions or comments on it as a whole? I think again we've given it a fairly good airing. The recommendations on the report are that the committee notes the content of the report, progress against the internal actions. We have raised issues. Need to note that. Okay, we'll move on to agenda item 10, which is why one of the main reasons for the meeting. The background to this, for those again who are very new to the council and weren't at the council meeting where this motion was presented, was that motion as detailed in the papers was presented to council in February.
Yeah, I looked at the recording. I was actually chairing the meeting.
Ah, right, so it must have been the earlier one. 12th of January meeting, and after some debate, amendment was proposed, which led to motion being referred to this committee to respond. At the last meeting, there was some discussion about how to deal with it. Back in March, the committee felt that a separate task and finish group was not the way to deal with it. Since then, so the plan was for a separate meeting, which we have. And in the intervening time, advice has been sought from a legal point of view, because one of the key aspects of referring it to Audit and Governance was to look at the issues of legality and practicality of implementing some of the proposals in the motion. So I'd like to ask Lisa to introduce the detail of the proposal. What I suggest is that we then discuss each of the 4 bullet points in the motion and hopefully come to a consensus as to how we feel we should respond to that.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, members. So the firstly, just to introduce the note from Mark Heath from Veal Wandsborough Bizard. I was asked at the last meeting if I had capacity to undertake a review of these legalities. And when I took that back to my desk the next day, the answer was no. And that is why Mark Heath was asked to do this note to assist members, because there is a long, as you will have read, background in terms of local government law, as well as then he's given some advice on practicalities. So you do have his full note in front of you. I think to assist members, on page 49 of your agenda pack, the instructions are where the points, where Mark Heath has numbered the points, and I think they're how we will look to address each of those. So the first point is around properly consulting all councillors and public before making any significant decisions. The second point is around exempt papers and how decisions are made around whether they remain exempt or do not remain exempt. The recording of decisions, submissions and decisions at all meetings attended by any person outside of Winchester City Council. And then the last one is the practicalities around non-disclosure agreements. So in respect of point 2, the exempt papers, that's where we have done that work. So that's at the back of Mark's note. Bear with me. I'm trying to give you a page number here, page 83. And then moving, when we get to our final point at point 4, that is on page 87, Chair, of your papers. Obviously happy to help with any questions of clarification where I'm able to assist. Thank you.
So I think what I'd like to do, try and structure this is if we look at the advice provided, bullet point 1, which is the Council commits to clearly demonstrate that it is open and transparent in all its decision making, specifically by, and bullet 1 is properly consulting all councillors and the public before making any significant decisions about council projects or other major financial transactions. Now, in some of the debate about this, both in the council meeting and I think in the previous meeting, there was, and accepted by Councillor Godfrey, who proposed the motion initially, is that the difficulty in defining what properly consulting is, and also what are significant decisions. The paper, or the advice from in the paper, suggests that some definitions, particularly for significant as being key decisions, I think, not mistaken, but fundamentally seems to come down with the view that our constitution already covers that and suggests that that nothing further is actually required to fulfil that obligation. Now, does the committee, have having read that advice, have a view?
Not so much a view, because I mean, yes, we never got the advice in front of us. It's more a case of defining what is significant, because one of the big things that came as a bit of a shock to me was how far we've got with station approach and how much money we've spent on consultants and officers without most of the council having a clue that was going on. Now, to me, that was a significant event because it was a question that was asked at a budget meeting, not this year, the year before, about what has been spent on station approach, and we were told it wasn't in a budget, and now we then find out lots of money being spent. So, to me, that was a significant decision that the councillors should have known about a lot earlier than we've now been told. And I would say principles are here, but I think we ought to comply with them, for want of a better description.
So, I mean, perhaps you're suggesting the legal advice is that there is sufficient there in terms of our constitution. So that is a question of, I suppose, in a way, a matter of opinion, but something that you perfectly justified to raise a process. I'm not sure that you seem to have more detail about it than I do, so to an extent. But does that still mean that you would agree with this proposal, which suggests that key decisions are very often bases for what are defined as key decisions?
I think, yes, there's nothing wrong with how this is defined. I think it's just a case of how it's interpreted inside the council itself, rather than actually having the rules that are there.
For me, the motion didn't refer to any specifics. It referred to council committing to demonstrate that it is open and transparent in its decision making, and how we might do that. So it didn't refer to specifics, it referred to a process and suggested that we weren't open and transparent and we didn't have an open and transparent process. And I think the legal guidance we have contradicts that completely, and states that is wrong and misleading to the public. So I have an issue that it was allowed through council and referred to this committee, that the council and chamber as a whole didn't have the confidence and understanding of the governance structure to be able to say that the council is committed to an open and transparent decision making and has processes in place to ensure that. So I have a real issue that, as I say, and a concern about the governance of the council as a whole, that A, senior councillors took that position and have this position and brought it to the council, and the council was not strong enough to push back and say, we are open and transparent, and to have this in front of us today and have us to spend money on legal counsel to tell us what we should already know.
Thank you. Any other comments there? Patrick, yeah.
Yeah, I hear what Councillor Krask has said there. However, I think the thing does twist on properly consulting all council. The council has a duty to clearly demonstrate, and I don't believe that that has been the case. It hasn't clearly demonstrated that its decision-making has been open and transparent. And it needs to be properly consulting councillors and the public before significant decisions. But how do you define a significant decision? Do you do it on the basis that it's a major council project or that it's a major financial transaction? I think maybe those are the areas that we need to concentrate on.
Yeah, there is, I mean, in here, on page 70 onwards, the very specifics about bullet point 1, at point 7.7 on page, does quite clearly say that the general duty to act fairly does not equate to general duty to consult, and I think this is where we're falling down or having difficulty is that there are a certain amount of things that there is a statutory duty to consult. We know what those are and the form of that consultation. Once you're outside of that, some of this advice suggests that sometimes it's actually legally dangerous to consult. You can be challenged because you've consulted. There is a point in, and it makes the point that legally, we don't have a legal responsibility to consult on all decisions. What we have is a legal responsibility to act fairly. That does not translate to mean that you consult on everything. And so the conclusion of this advice suggests that within our constitution, we have all the checks and balances there. Now, if there's a specific instance that Miller has raised on the relation approach, it should be within the legal advice suggests we have the structure and the process in place. So Miller has a very specific here that he could potentially argue within this that he hasn't been given the information. Therefore, we haven't applied with the Constitution as an administration. So it's again, I want to keep it to is the process, because we're a process committee. Are we happy that the advice here suggests that we actually have the correct processes in place to actually produce the results that broader statement about properly consult significant decisions? Because right at the end, his conclusion is that a better starting point would be 0.741 on page 74. Suggests that the starting point by committing to act in accordance with the Council's constitution, which states that decisions will be made in accordance with these principles. So the legal advice is effectively, if you extend that to add in those constitutional bits, it is, which we already have, because we already have the constitution. So our choice is to say we need to make that statement, or we don't need to make that statement because it's already exists. And I think that's really where we need to decide whether that is sufficient whether we accept that, because the advice seems to say that the Constitution covers it. But what he's suggesting here is that you could add to this, the initial statement bullet, by committing to act in accordance with the Constitution element, and that resolves. But there is an argument to say, well, you don't even need to make that statement because the Constitution exists. But that's the point I'm making. Councillor Power looks as though she'd like to contribute here. So.
Thank you, Chairman. I was getting a little fidgety there. I think there are very, and I don't know where they're defined, but there are very clear limits as to what level of decision can be made by officers, what financial level of decision has to be made by a portfolio holder's decision day, and what decisions have to be made by council. Now, there seems to be an implication here that those levels of authorisation and indeed public decision making were not followed, and I find that surprising. Is that, may I ask, Councillor Miller, is that the implication here?
I think in that case, yes, but it isn't just, it's the whole principle. I mean, let's be fair, we've had so many judicial reviews and we've now got one on River Park. You know, is there something wrong with our system that we end up spending so much money on getting advice in, and are we making the right decisions properly? Because River Park has caused us an awful lot of aggravation. Now, obviously whoever made those decisions thought they'd made the right decisions properly. We've now got a legal challenge as to whether we did, and certainly the public don't think we consulted enough on it. Which may be a different issue, I agree. We may have the rules, but it's how they're being perceived, I think, is my bigger.
Yeah, and I think that was probably part of the basis for the motion. It's about perception as much as anything else, but it is around one very, very specific, which I think events have shown that there are a group of people who think we didn't do it right, who shouted very loudly, but there are also a lot of other people who thought we took the right decision, and as a council. So it's a difficult balance there where, and a mistake was made as well. So, I mean, perhaps Lisa would like to comment on that specifically.
I think there is one thing that might help the committee in terms of, yes, the number of judicial review actions that are taken, but in answer to the council question, the number of judicial reviews, and this was a few months ago, Councillor Miller, we had defended and won more than double the amount of cases that we had conceded. And therefore, when we talk about the number of judicial reviews, I think it's more accurate to talk about those that have both been conceded and those that were successfully defended, and the council were successful in defending their position. In respect of River Park, I have to be very careful not to steer into legal advice because we need to go into exempt session. But you will be aware that we had our Queen's Council representative with us throughout all those decision-making meetings, and including the non-decision scrutiny meeting. So we had that advisor here and available to all members, and certainly to our cabinet members when they took that decision. And the QC's the advice continues to be that the council made a fair and lawful decision.
Not arguing that it was. I certainly wouldn't say it was a bad decision either, but it's how we're perceived somehow, isn't it?
And I think your point about station approach is again a difficult one. No decision has been taken. This is about preparatory work now, but the decision has been made to spend some money on some preparatory work, and I think that's what you're looking at, and that probably is not something you'd consult on. Consultant to make preparatory work. The whole point is to consult on the very early stages of things, but we're trying to get to the early stages of things, and so I think we've got to be clear about what we're talking about, because that probably is not a level of decision making. If we get into the point of consulting of shall we spend some money on some consultants to try and get something to get a proposal that we can consult on, I mean, we end up in a sort of Kafkaesque world of bureaucracy that has gone completely insane. So I want to try and bring it back to, does the committee accept this legal advice that our constitution covers the detail? Neil, yeah, you have
It's an observation at reading through this. You know, for the first time, I was not involved in any of this, and one of the key things that comes across from the legal advice is that, you know, is this 7.12, where they say broadly, the more serious the impact, the more likely it is that fairness requires the involvement of affected individuals in the decision-making process in some manner that may not, if not legally, be full consultation, but may well be some other form of involving them that legally, in the opinion of the council, is appropriate and proportionate. Now, it's the bit that is fair, the fairness, which seems to be lacking in my reading of this, in the final advice. Then, you know, the lawyer says the action must be proportionate to the desired outcome, but there's some test of reasonableness or fairness seems to be lacking in it, in my reading of it.
But I think the point is made that any challenge, we have a duty to operate in a fair manner. And I think the other point that's made in this advice is that generally government have stepped back from finding, you know, we have a certain amount of things that are statutory consultation. We have to have consultation and various other aspects. But the government generally stood back from adding to that list, partly because it's very difficult to define what's fair and what's not. So that is a judgment that has to be made by the council. ISIS suggests the Constitution gives us all the right tools to make that decision on areas where we don't have to statutorily consult and to what level of consultation. There might be a difference of opinion in the council, and to a certain extent, not sure if I should say this, but I think I will say it, having been a councillor in opposition for 7 of my 10 years, the amount of information that you see is less, and I get the impression that it's been quite difficult for those councillors who are in administration for that 7 years, who find themselves in opposition, to suddenly discover they do not have a handle on quite as much information as they were used to. That doesn't necessarily mean that we've got the system wrong. And compare, you know, I've talked to councillors and other councils who are in the opposition group, and they get no information. You know, we're a pretty good council on that. So I don't want to confuse that concern with, you know, we're back to, have we got a process in place that, if applied, covers that fairness test and produces consultations when it's needed? And if you think we do, I think we've resolved that particular issue, but I'm open to Patrick.
I think we agree with you on the process being correct, actually covering the requirements. I think we'd like to emphasize to clearly that the council does need to clearly demonstrate properly consulting councillors before making any, and here I think we need to emphasize significant decisions about council projects, and we can emphasize that, we move.
I suppose my question would be, how do you define significant
significant decisions about council. Well, obviously, it's not part and parcel of the requiring a decision consultation through consultants project, but it very much need to be a significant decision about the council project at a later stage and major above the level of what was actually determined by Councillor Power. She talked about there are specific various levels of.
But I still think we come back to this difficulty that Councillor Miller raised in the first place about, using the example of station approach. No significant decision has been taken about station approach as to where we're going with it, because we will, the council will consult on that. But what I've heard was an argument that said money has been spent on the preparatory work, and is that a significant decision? And should it, what is proper consulting on that significant decision? And I get the implication is that all councillors should at least have known that that's happening. Now that can be a debate and an argument, but what we really need to do is this process significant? And I think, given that the preamble was about transparency, and the suggested wording here does include, in 741, it's the first line, then bullet 1, does say properly consulting, and then saying by committing to act in accordance with the Constitution. Now, if you're asking for something extra to that almost needs to be a change to the Constitution, because the advice is suggesting the Constitution covers it. And I'm just wondering, the wording that you talked about is there, but it's actually saying by committing to act, you are properly within that Constitution. So I mean, unless we have any other suggestions, I mean, are you happy with that?
We're happy with it at this point, yeah.
If the committee's agreed on bullet 1, we accept the advice as set out 741 as that being the sensible response to it. Are we happy with that? Because I want to move to each bullet
Agreed.
point and do that.
What are we actually suggesting as an outcome? Work on bullet.
Well, I'm suggesting that the committee, having read the advice, accepts that the advice that bullet point 1 can be satisfied by committing to act in accordance with the council's constitution, because that's the, there is the bullet point there, and the suggested starting point is to say it works by acting, by being committed to act in the council's constitution. As I said earlier, I mean, one option is to say, as a committee, well, the council's constitution covers it, therefore we don't need to say anything at all. But we can, we're saying exactly the same thing, effectively, by accepting that advice. And yeah, go on.
Just looking around, I think I was one of the few councillors in the last Audit and Governance Committee meeting which recommended that this was referred to this special event, and Councillor Godfrey was in that meeting as well. And we had the discussion around what does properly mean, what does significant mean, which is why it was then referred to further legal advice. We have the legal advice which talks to what we have in the Constitution. I think my concern about by lifting what's suggested, that there's some implication that didn't properly consult before making decision making, before making any significant decisions. If we make a statement this effect, there's some suggestion that that didn't take place, but the Constitution's been in effect for the period, so it seems nonsensical and somewhat misleading to recommit to something you've already committed to.
Yeah, I understand where you're coming from on that, but I think the point is that the motion actually was non-specific. It wasn't referring in any cases, any specific cases. It was non-specific. And so what we're doing, I mean, what you could do is add into there some point about the fact the Constitution has existed there for 3 years and we've been operating within that constitutional framework. But I don't know if that's necessary. I mean, I can see your point, and that's why I made the point about that choice. But I don't think there's any harm in.
Could we say by continuing to commit fact in accordance, just to demonstrate a level of continuity? Wasn't any suggestion that the Constitution exist?
I'd be happy with that, but I think we want to have a consensus. So
I think the actual motion was as a result of River Park's lack of consultation, and that was the area that was most concerned, I think, in terms of the motion being council, saying that there was no problem at all there and that it was done by the book. You actually clearly demonstrated openness and transparency. A lot of people think that's not the case. So therefore, I think we need to look at it again.
Reopen and discuss it further.
No.
You're happy to accept.
I'm happy to accept
that as it is.
I'm just acting.
Well, because there's no specific mention of any other any specific concerns, it's a general motion about. Does not mention any specific incident. I think either way, from my perspective, but if we get consensus, unless you vehemently, I think you've made the point, but would we be quite happy to, or would you feel that you cannot agree to it without putting continuing?
I'd like, in some ways, to endorse Councillor Crest's point that there needs to be an ability somehow to say, without commenting on the past or having not been provided with any specific examples, we are saying that we endorse the recommendation that we are able to say today the council commits to clearly demonstrate without making any comment about whether it has or not in the past, and therefore we're not saying within the motion we continue, but we're saying, having been asked to say, is the council prepared to say today that this is what it does? We're prepared to say that this is what this is wording that we're prepared to use. Would that satisfy?
So we are agreed, and just look to those who haven't commented on it. Are you happy to agree that on that one? Because otherwise we could be here a long time. So the bullet point 2 was about the exempt minutes, and so the motion said within 12 months of a decision being made, publishing without restriction all papers used to support decisions on projects and other major financial transactions that were marked as exempt from publication at the time of decision, unless full council decides that these papers should remain exempt for a further 12 months. Well, I think one of the points about this is that actually, I think it was, I can't remember exactly when it was, but it was raised with the monitoring officer by Cabinet that we wanted to be able to do with exempt paper. The papers shouldn't remain exempt, and COVID got in the way. And but Lisa's been working on that, and she has a proposal. Again, in some of the discussion on the motion, there was questions, and this is one of the things that we need to resolve, questions about the practicality of it going, taking a whole series of exempt papers to full council. And so we have the proposal, which is on page 83, I think, which we as a committee, if we agree, on that. Turn it off. It probably is work. No, it's not. Okay. So yes. So you have the proposal for the procedure on reviewing exempt reports, which is perhaps more practical than going to council. Can I have comments, please?
Thank you, Chair. Looking at the exempt report itself, the procedure summary on page 83, I could ask everybody around the table to look at that. Page 83, in point number 2, we read that the report author is asked to only recommend whether or not the item should be reclassified as open. In point 3, we also read the Democratic Services team emailing the monitoring officer with only the recommendation from the report author. In point 4, we read that the monitoring officer will confirm whether or not the item should be reclassified. So we have the report author only making recommendations, whilst the monitoring officer is making the decisions. As far as I was aware, the democratic principle to be effective and the elected representatives to be accountable, it is for the officers to inform and make recommendations, for the elected councillors, either individually or in committee, to make the decisions. Officers inform, councillors decide. May I suggest small but meaningful word changes as follows? Point 4 should read, the monitoring officer will report the decision of the report author as to whether or not the item should be reclassified as open. Point 5 should read, summary of items reviewed and the monitoring officer's comments on the report author's decision presented to the Audit and Governance Committee as part of the course. Finally, in regard to checks and balances and right of review, I would strongly recommend that openness and transparency requires that the Audit and Governance Committee should, if felt necessary, have the authority by majority vote to refer the decision to. Thank you, Chair.
I'll ask monitoring officer if she feels that that's practically the same. We have to look at legality. I think I personally see likelihood of so full council would have to attempt on that paper, whereas and they disagree with the recommendation, which is in most cases we can. If you're happy, are you happy with that? Is it?
Chair, if I could just make some comments, and then perhaps members of the committee can debate that and discuss it. If I can explain some of the reasons behind the process, Councillor Cunningham, that might help explain where we've got to. In the first place, when a report comes to Executive Leadership Board and it says it's exempt or not, I will challenge that. And Richard Botham, who you know has been here for many, many years, has commented the reduction in the number of pink papers in recent years has been significant. And that's because it's very easy for an officer to say, oh, you know, there's a bit of commercially confidential information here, and to make the whole report exempt. And my pushback has always been, well, that can be information that's in an appendix, because actually it's really important that we make the decision as openly as we can and in an open session. But the challenge has actually come from this table in terms of trying to make that as transparent as possible. It's the officer, it's the report author who knows that report and decision inside out and back to front. And they are the person who has said this information is commercially confidential and it's for these particular reasons. And they are most likely to know when that information is no longer commercial. And that's because some houses might have been built, the deal's been done, you know, it's a public record at land registry, and those things that I wouldn't know. So the reason for going to the report author first of all is so they can go, yeah, we built those houses, or absolutely that deal was done, the contract signed, you know, those practical matters. And I'm talking about commercial information because 99% of exemptions, I would say, relate to that, with the other one relating to personal information. And personal information can only become unexempt if it doesn't relate to a living individual. So there's going to be very few circumstances where we're likely to know if that would be the case, Councillor Cunningham, in terms of being able to make that report unexempt, because it depends on their death. So I'm focusing on commercial information. The report author can make a recommendation. Now, in terms of when I receive that recommendation, I might indeed challenge that, because I might say, well, I know, but that will be public information in land registry. So why would we need to continue to say that that information needs to be exempt? So the reason for a recommendation from the officer is so there can be some challenge in terms of the decision that's ultimately made. Now, I don't have a concern with there being an audit and governance referral to council. The only thing I would say, and I have said this before in a full council meeting, is it's a matter of law whether it's exempt information or not, and that's under the 19th, it's Part 1, Schedule 12A of the Local Government Act, but it's very specifically a matter of law. Now, the decision about whether the law applies has always been an officer one. The decision about whether you as decision takers move into exempt session to discuss that is your decision. But the risks of not going into exempt when the law has said that is either commercial information or personal information, I think the stakes are higher on personal, Councillor Cunningham, than they are for others, but there are those ramifications. So we only apply that exemption as a matter of law. There's only, well, there used to be 8 categories. I think there's even less now. And some of those are clarified. And some of those are also have the public interest test. So you'll know with data protection and freedom of information, there's often a public interest test. So that's also added. So I'm not opposed to it. I just don't, I think we would have considered that when the monitoring officer makes their decision. I'll consult the data protection officer as needed, etc., etc. And that will be the advice based on the law. So if you wanted to unexempt something by a majority of council, that's the same risk every member takes if they ever said they didn't want to move into exempt session. Is that clear? Have I explained that well enough?
Yeah, I think I can for it. The reality would then be that your recommendation to audit and governance is virtually impossible for audit, which is fair enough, because you the only, therefore I don't see there being a problem with it, endorsing those recommendations, which is what the main thrust of it. I suppose I would prefer to stick it there, and if you've failed to endorse it, it has to go back and be reviewed, rather, because it's a legal point. it would be very, very risky to then at that point say, actually, we don't endorse, so it's got to go to council. Party thing, and we would leave ourselves in a legally very, very difficult position. So it's unlikely, I mean, it's unlikely to ever happen. But I'm not sure if there's value in that. I would much prefer it to be, go back and have another look at it. Not entirely convinced of the argument, but we're going to take the risk on a point of law. You know
Okay,
what I mean?
is there a process or a proposal that could be progressed?
Yeah, I think so. I think there's two options then before audit and governance, and that would be if the monitoring officer makes the decision to unexempt a report, that can happen the next day. Or if you're, and we will report that in the quarterly reporting. So it will go in DSU, you've seen in mod.gov, you'll get an email. So we're trying to really be very, very open. Councillor Cunningham, I was amazed. Some councils that have this process don't report it anywhere. So how is anyone ever going to know that a report that was exempt 2 years ago is now unexempt? So that was why it was really important, and that is all about open and transparency, to make sure that we let members know that. And then it was also reported in a public way so that members of the public could also see and hear that. If I bring the recommendations in that quarterly report to audit and governance, it would have to come to one of your meetings, and whereas a report could be unexempted next week, it might be 3 months away, because it will depend on where it lies with. So I just want to outline that risk of the delay of unexempting a report, so it comes here for you to approve, rather than the suggestion before you that it's reported to you that this has happened. And that's the two differences. And that's a choice for them.
I think it's more a question of those that you agree can be reclassified as non-exempt are not a problem. We'd like that to happen as quickly as possible. What we would need, I think, as an audit governance committee is report on those that you remain exempt, and perhaps have to go into an exempt session ourselves to discuss those that remain exempt. Now, as you pointed out, some of those are based on personal information. There's no argument. If it's on, if there are clear reasons why they should stay exempt, they should be, those reasons should be reported to the committee, and I would suggest that in 99% of the cases, the audit committee will accept. So I would have thought that's perhaps the process, is that we should be able to review the non-reclassified one.
Got a suggestion for a word on that basis. So I've said on point 5, summary of all items reviewed and the decision made by the monitoring officer reported to Audit and Governance Committee. And yes, it's very sensible to include that as an appendix, so that if we needed to go into exempt, we could. We will try and work out a way of reporting that in open, but we'll just need to think through some of the practicalities of that.
If it's a matter of law as to whether or not something can be released, and you exercising your legal knowledge or let's depersonalize it, the monitoring officer is exercising their professional judgment. Perhaps what we need, like we've obtained for the motion, is an independent legal verification which either confirms your view or provides reasons as to challenge your view, which you can then say, well, we've received and I continue to recommend to you for the following reasons. Why? Because if you just land up signing something, well, not you, the monitoring officer continues to sign things off and it comes to us, I'm not going to be well placed to say, well, actually, I disagree and I think this needs to be released. But I would value a second opinion, and it's only at what stage do we seek that opinion in order to be able to continue to justify keeping it exempt.
Yeah, and I'd actually suggest that that point comes, there is a disagreement between the two recommendations, but I think it should come to the audit committee first, because I don't think we should be committing ourselves to expense on every item that's not reclassified. So the non-reclassified one audit, if we have concerns about the decision, we could look at a second opinion. I think it's highly unlikely, again, with the majority of them, that we would have concerns, but there may be a contentious issue. There is it just gives the flexibility for that, but it's unlikely, as I say, again, part of the openness thing, it is open for challenge at some stage if need be. I don't want to create a situation where we're taking independent legal advice on a regular basis for every last decision. We need to be able to trust our monitoring officer in 99% of the, but there may be contention. What we want to keep politics out of this as well, because actually very often those exempt papers, like them out there. Any one of us might want it out there, but for one reason or another. But if there's a legal reason for it not, I think chances of challenging it. If you're happy with that, Lisa, you're not happy with it. I see that. But if it's very much a last resort.
Councillor Cutler, my only issue with it is the potential for there to be significant cost attached to this, because if I said to you, when I get a report, because I see all the reports and I might have already pushed back on an exemption of a report, so if someone comes to me and says, this is just an example, the affordable homes in Whiteley, because I remember public participation, there was pushback about why some of that was exempt, so I know there's public interest in that, and when that comes to me and they're saying it's still exempt, and I would probably push back and say, hang on a minute, I remember the press release where there was a spade in the ground, the deal's done, the price is done, that they are not commercial terms anymore, and I can give that kickback actually very quickly because I've got that corporate intelligence around that decision. If you're going to an independent legal advisor, they will have to read extensive reports from start to finish and come to I might need to speak to the officers involved, if it's financial appraisal information. I can just think that actually that could become really long-winded, and I think that, and I'm in the position, but I think you absolutely have to trust that the open and transparency, the whole point of why we started this work pre-pandemic is because we wanted to be open and transparent. If I wanted to be like other councils, I wouldn't be saying let's report that in the quarterly reporting to Audit and Governance, because I want it to be open. I'd say let's not put an email out to all councillors on mod.gov because I want to hide it. Or I do what the majority of councils do and just keep them exempt. So I actually already think that this is a gold standard approach to exempt reports, and to add independent legal scrutiny is really difficult for officers.
Yeah, I mean, I can't see there'd be very many cases that, one, we go against the monitoring officer's opinion, and two, that the majority of the audit committee would vote against it. So it would have to be something pretty exceptional for us to even want to consider that. It isn't just a case of somebody not liking it. It's got to be the majority of us don't like it for a start.
I think it's creating an additional safeguard. Therefore, I leave it there. But what we're talking about, the key thing actually is all those papers that are easily, you look at and they're reclassified. It's the ones that aren't reclassified become a potential problem, but there is bound in most cases it to be really clear cut as to why it can't be reclassified. I suppose the likelihood is very, very small of the monitoring officer presenting detailed argument why it should stay as exempt. And then the committee disagreeing with the decision. I just think it's very, very unlikely, but there may be circumstances. So I don't think we're actually, maybe it's two belt and braces, but there does seem to be enthusiasm to have that final if needed. Mike first, and then Pat.
Yeah, I'm keen to support and empower officers with their role. Sure, not into undermine their professional knowledge. I think if we were to vote as a committee, I don't know that we would be voting against the judgment and the assessment of the monitoring officer, because we wouldn't be in a position to do that. All we could do is vote to refer it to an independent. Is that right? So we wouldn't be voting against the monitoring officer, because we clearly couldn't do that. All we could do would be to vote and send it to independent. Which might happen more often.
Yeah, I think that's where the risk is. Then it starts being an expense that's unnecessary. You actually need to strongly disagree. I think it is a tricky one. I can see that it's not included there. Finance head says all circumstances where we, when we are, and I think you've argued it very well to say that we're way ahead of.
Can I offer a compromise? Because I am really against this, because I think that there would be, is it possible, say, there would be more political motivation for a piece of exempt information to be released than there would for a motivation for a monitoring officer to give proper, decent, full legal advice. How about we do this for 12 months? Because I think that will give us a really good idea about what's coming in front of the committee or not. And then in 12 months' time, you think, actually, we want to, there were some things, that you disagreed with the monitoring officer, and we want to put that in. So it will be minuted for the record. We can put it back into review. Because, if there really is that circumstance, I hear you, but my gut feel is it won't happen. So let's see where this takes us. Chair, if that's helpful.
I think actually that's a very good suggestion, simply because if we start the process today and review in a year's time, there'll be a few papers. There's just a very remote chance there might be a couple of papers and exempt for 6 months long. And that's very unlikely, a very remote chance. So I'd be quite happy with that. Does it, Mike, comment?
I'm not going to disagree with what you're saying, but more just to expand on what Lisa's saying in terms of if you had a change of administration, then there might be a political incentive to release papers which against the monitoring officer's advice. I think that's a kind of example I'm imagining that.
Yeah, I do think this separation, so that it can't be a political. So, would you be happy to accept that as the process, that it comes back to get a quarterly report, all the recommendations, with an explanation of the recommendation, and as a committee we endorse or no, we have no other way of endorse. We can only endorse, can't we, or ask for further review of that paper, couldn't we?
Yeah, refer for further review. and a built-in sunset clause of 12 months.
Well, you can't have that. Sunset clause in what? What, in terms of bring the review back? Yeah, yeah. Okay. Are we happy with that? We agree with that? Okay, sorry. We do need to deal with this motion in detail, and I know it's taking a lot longer than I expected. So we'll move on to bullet point 3, which I hope will not be particularly contentious, because the legal advice does suggest that it is a complete nightmare to even consider. So are we happy, having read that advice, except bullet 3 cannot be?
Okay. It's okay with us.
So we'll move on to the one that is possibly contentious then, which is the NDA. Which again, I'd like Lisa to explain the position as she sees it.
Yeah, members. So what I've been up to in the month following the council meeting in governance is actually trying to quantify and look back over the last 5 years in terms of actually the number. And I've not just kept that to non-disclosure agreements, because sometimes they can be called confidentiality agreements, and sometimes in one instance they are called both things at once. So I've gone to the organisation, and that is the table on page 87 of your pack, in terms of when and where those have been used. I've offered an opinion in that on that page 87 that these agreements should always be the exception. I did understand the caution that was being aired by officers in respect to the financial appraisal information in the outline business case for Central Winchester regeneration, but as soon as the matter was raised with me, met with the project director and section 151 officer, and agreed and took immediate action to remove the requirement for that NDA, and emailed all councillors that, and it was that same day was added to mod.gov for all to access. It's arguable, and arguable means it can be argued either way, whether an indemnity is legally enforceable about a councillor, and that's simply because is there an intention to create a legal relation, and that's the contractual relationship that you can have, and that's definitely arguable. And therefore one of my recommendations to the committee was that any indemnity where any non-disclosure agreement where there was an indemnity, a full and open indemnity applied, which was not in the station approach architects panel and was not in the Central Winchester regeneration reference group but was in the others, that those councillors are released from that formal indemnity, but with the remainder of that agreement remaining in force. And if I just talk to you a little bit about that. So, for example, the viewing of the 2 contracts, the non-disclosure agreement said about not taking photographs and not sharing and not taking any of that information away, and then included the indemnity. So we take that indemnity away, but it would still mean that that councillor could not share that information that they gained by viewing those contracts at that time. So that would be for those. The exception would be in relation to Central Winchester regeneration. This is the outline business case financial appendix. I removed the non-disclosure agreement from the second cabinet paper, but this was there was a first cabinet paper with very similar or the same financial information that was subject to a non-disclosure agreement, and with the Audit and Governance Committee's approval, I think the same process should be gone to in relation to the release on that first cabinet report. I was asked this by the Leader of the Opposition in terms of that release. The fact it had already been referred to Audit and Governance, I said it was a matter for this committee to make that decision, and I would action that decision of the committee. But my recommendation is that the release applies to the first report as it did to the second. In terms of some improvements that I would recommend to the process, at the moment it doesn't need the approval of our Executive Leadership Board, and the terms are not approved by the monitoring officer. I absolutely think that both of those things should happen. I've already said that I think that NDA should be the absolute exception, but there are circumstances where I think those are necessary, because there are times when members receive information that is not part of their role as a ward councillor, not part of any overview and scrutiny or decision-making committee paper, and is not part of the need to know right that a councillor has. So a good example would be the Central Winchester Regeneration Reference Group, where there's a lot and a wide-ranging pieces of information. So the 9 individuals, that includes 3 councillors, are subject to a non-disclosure and confidentiality agreement. So, Chair, I hope that helps. The final one is in some of the discussions from both sides of the chamber in terms of the non-disclosure agreement, I heard concerns from one side of the chamber that it was actually quite difficult in mod.gov and on an iPad to distinguish between exempt and non-exempt. And in respect of the indemnity, just being really clear what that meant. And I heard, real concerns about people, the concerns of the effect of that. And therefore, you'll see on page, I've got a printout in black and white, which is not helpful, but on page 91 of your papers, there is a mod.gov, just a mock-up of what a pink paper would look like. It's too pink. So for the new councillors, when you used to get your paper bundle, when it was on good old-fashioned paper, it would be really obvious because the back papers would be your pink exempt papers and the rest would be white. So it was really, really clear to you what was exempt and what wasn't. So what we're trying to do now is to replicate that in mod.gov, because at the moment it's all white. So the pink is very pink, Councillor Cutler, but I think it's well, I hope that members think that's helpful in order to make that. Okay. Thank you.
Simply because it might make it difficult to read. Well, thank you for those views. I think one of the interesting points that came up earlier, talking about code of conduct, which for many councillors the argument is can be covered by the code of conduct. A point made earlier that as soon as someone resigns, they're not covered by the code of conduct. That does lead to a problem because no action could be taken. So I think, and this is something as my view to start the discussion, is that NDA shouldn't be used except in exceptional circumstances, but to preclude their use completely perhaps would create problems. But I think we're all uncomfortable with overuse, more than the absolute minimum use. So that's my start of all. We have a proposal, officer, to release all the indemnities, release the whole NDA for. But you're not proposing to release any of the others?
Of all the indemnities, yes, but that the non-disclosure agreement would stay in place. So, for example, the Station Approach Architects Panel, the viewing of the Winchester Sport and Leisure Park contract, the viewing of the Environmental Services contract, and the Central Winchester Regeneration Reference Group.
Given that the Station Approach Architects Panel, we're back to this whole position about exempt papers. Again, this is similar sort of arguments. Is there any relevance to the information that that panel would have seen to current state of affairs with Station Approach? Because there was a scheme, it failed. Is there any relevance to that NDA? Or it's a bit like reviewing the Winchester Leisure Park contract is commercially confidential and still confidential, so I see no problem. Perhaps that's also true of the. I'm just wondering about that distance station approach architects panel. I think, in principle, again, a bit like exempt papers, it becomes the agreement should be. They're my comments on this.
I mean, generally, I agree. The only thing about anything like the station approach is, did it have figures that firms might not want released even now, like their prices and the difference between some of the architects, because having bead on that, some of the differences were enormous, and there was an argument about locals against outsiders for the city. So I think if the officer thinks we should keep it that way, I think we should, because otherwise we could just start a whole series of rows that we don't need for that reason.
I floated the idea, and you've convinced me that.
Councillor Miller, you're spot on. That was the procurement of the architectural services. So I think particularly with your earlier comments about station approach, actually that's relevant than perhaps even before.
Yeah, I suppose my only point about that is purely that. I mean, it does create a problem actually when we start talking about this, because I assume that some of the councillors who signed that, well, no, there's only 5. Just thinking, by releasing that NDA, you're not implying to councillors that they can then release that information, because they're still bound by the confidentiality of being councillor. But of course, when you go back 4 years, you have no sanction against the 3 individuals who aren't councillors. So this actually proves the point on the need for them when they're mixed groups, but also getting the impression that Stephen might have been one of those too, but I don't remember. But they're probably not, they're possibly not still councillors, so there would be no other mechanism by which you could insist that they kept that information confidential. So yes, I see I take your point.
Lisa, could you just explain for me what obligation you're seeking to impose by keeping the NDA in place without the indemnity that wouldn't already exist?
Yeah, so it depends on a case-by-case basis. So on the procurement of the architectural services for station approach, for example, their undertaking was to keep all information as part of the tender process confidential, not to disclose it unless I'm required to do so by law, not to discuss it with anyone other than advisory and evaluation panel members, officers of the council, council members or professional advisors for this procurement, or as required by law, and on the conclusion of the evaluation either to return to the council or securely delete and destroy all electronic and paper copies of it. So if, for example, Councillor Bolton, one of the members of this procurement, I don't know, in 6 months' time comes in waving a piece of paper, there was an agreement that said, well, you should have either securely deleted or destroyed of paper copies or returned them to the council, so you shouldn't have that anymore. But you would still be able to say, because station approach is an ongoing project. So that's an example on the station approach one, whereby that would still apply.
Clearly, there's concern over the fact that ex-councillors could do exactly that. Why can we not basically keep the NDAs in ex-councillors?
There is the potential. There is the potential. Like I said, it's arguable about the legal enforceability of the indemnity of the NDA. There could still be private law action that could be taken against an ex-councillor, you know, that disclosed what was previously and very clearly confidential information, and that's easier if they have signed a non-disclosure agreement than having not. What I would say to all our councillors is the difficulty with any of these is evidencing a breach in the first place, because how do you prove who disclosed the information to who? And that's why when I looked at this, I cannot find a successful case of an enforcement of an NDA against a councillor or someone involved in a council. Tracking back years, I tried to to find that, to be able to give you that example, and I cannot find that. When you look at code of conduct complaints around the release of confidential information, I cannot find a case where it was successfully proved that a councillor disclosed information that they were supposed to keep confidential. I cannot find that in any records going back. So I think it's actually a very high bar, and we're saying, and there would have to be an active decision, even if you had evidence of breach, to seek to enforce that in some way. So there are so many hurdles to get through prior to getting to the point. I think it's more, it's a reminder, and it's where you don't have access to those papers through your committee role. So this wouldn't apply to any committee papers, but were you to belong to a reference group or a procurement panel, which is outside any of this, that's where I could see in exceptional circumstances may still say a non-disclosure agreement would be prudent. On a case-by-case basis.
So to be clear, your proposals about the previous, I think what's more important for us is the process of, one, the presumption that they're used very sparingly, exactly how we word that, and the second point being your process that it has to go to ELB and it has to go through monitoring office, which up till now has not been the case. And so I think that puts more safeguards. Now, as a fair bit of discussion, I'm quite happy to have some more if we need to, but at this stage, are there any other comments, or do we go?
I think there's just one other thing for me to explore is that, and I'll be up front in terms of, I don't have a problem myself with NDAs. I signed the indemnity clause for CWR. Don't have a problem with it at all. Maybe I'm being naive, but completely fine. There is obviously the case where they can be overused, unlike the safeguards that have been put in place. You, from the legal view, I don't know if it's a legal view per se, but the advice that was sought was around they should very, very much be the exception. And our view is that the code of conduct, which makes breach of confidentiality by a member a potential code, is an adequate solution. So I think a lot rests on the code of conduct and on members' awareness and knowledge of the code of conduct. I'm not convinced that all councillors are as aware of the code of conduct as they could be. I think I've had one code of conduct training since I've been councillor in 4 years. I can't say that the training I had was the best training I've ever had. The code of conduct is changing, as you say. I think it is very complicated. I think I don't think it's real for people. There's one example I use, which is quite a common one in terms of if the councillor has a house or the property or the land next to them developed, do they have a prejudicial interest in that development? They have a disclosable pecuniary interest. I think many councillors wouldn't actually, they'd have to think about that. So I don't think there's enough knowledge about the code of conduct by councillors. I think for something that is particularly commercial, I think where we have councillors that are operating in that space, I can understand why a monitoring officer would want to use an NDA, particularly when I refer to my earlier comments around a lack of awareness of the governance process. If you've got councillors that aren't aware of the Constitution or the Code of Conduct, or we didn't talk much about option 3, but in the bullet point 3, when you're operating with councillors with questionable knowledge about the Code of Conduct and how to apply that, I think NDAs are completely appropriate. So, but I agree with what you're saying in terms of safeguards, but I understand why they were used, and I think they're appropriate.
Yeah, I agree that NDAs are useful. Indemnities are actually a very strange idea because basically, unless you're a very, very wealthy councillor, it won't matter because you'll run out of money for your legal fees before you get to the case against you, because anybody that's going to sue you for a lot of money, you'll be running into hundreds of thousands of pounds before you've even got to court where you win or lose. So indemnities are a bad idea because they're actually almost not non-threat to anybody that hasn't got any money.
I think one of the things that's come out of this discussion, actually, either the code of conduct, even if everyone was aware of it, or are likely enforceable, are going to be very difficult to enforce. Evident breach is actually quite to prove anyway. So what they act as is a reminder, a pretty strong reminder. You have a legal obligation here, which is slightly more than the legal obligation the Code of Conduct confers. So I think we're all agreed that they may be appropriate at times. That the indemnity element of it is irrelevant, and so you wouldn't put that in future NDAs, essentially. We're also, I think, agreed tightening up that process so that it has to go through the ERB is new councillors. That's another one that I've used regularly, ELB and leaderboard. You missed it because I'm very conscious about jargon when you first and I think we've generally agreed with which ones should be removed now. So are we happy to accept that as a process?
So, yeah, I've just got
Yes, we're content.
one point to make. Sorry, Patrick. When new councillors have their training, are they aware about these NDAs? Is it mentioned?
No, Councillor Atchwell, and I would say the reason for that is because we're taking them away in respect of any committee report. So the number of councillors who would have to sign an NDA over the last 5-year period is less than 10. So it's just in terms of being proportionate. There is one thing that's now swirling around my mind, Mike, and it's less code of conduct, because the code of conduct is where a complaint goes, but it is about members' awareness. Now, you know, I think we're very clear, and members do their data protection module of their training because you're data controller for the information that you have. But page 80 of the report, in terms of Mark Heath's advice, he raises the Information Commissioner becoming involved, and I would like to specifically reference to councillors. There was a case where some councillors who were privy to some personal sensitive information and aired that, I believe, in a council meeting, and were fined heavily by the Information Commission. And that was completely outside of anything the council were in control of. They have no jurisdiction there. That's just something for members to bear in mind. What I'm thinking of, Mike, is we don't say that in Code of Conduct. It's not quite there, but I need to make sure that members, through their data protection training, are aware of that, because that was 3 significant fines for 3.
Okay, so thanks for that intervention, but you made the point.
All I would say is with NDAs, we don't need to train every councillor. It's only any of those are ever going to have to sign one we should worry about. There's no point training 45 people every year and finding out that nobody actually signs any and they've left the council and never even come across one.
Okay, thanks for that. I think I'm determined that we do not have a meeting that lasts hours, because Councillor Power will say, I've managed them all in 2 for the last 2 years. But I think we've had a useful discussion. I think we're fairly clear in our response to those 4 bullet points, and so thanks for everyone for your contributions. Are we all happy that we've reasonable that motion? Okay, so I will. I think that's it. Is it not? So I'll declare the
Sorry,
meeting.
Mike.
Sorry.
Neil, I've got one further point.
Oh, you've got one further point.
Yeah, I would, if possible, I'd be interested to know how much it costs to have this report made by an external person. How much it costs the council.
I don't think I've got the invoice yet, Councillor Atchwell, but I will check that. So off the top of my head, no, I'm pretty sure I haven't, but I will let you know.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, thank you all. I conclude the meeting, which I promise I will try to make sure that no other meetings go. But we have got a big agenda in July. Okay, thanks very much.